Hi, everybody. You're all very welcome to this parent information talk on how to support a child with anxiety. This talk is presented by the Mayo Primary Care Child and Adolescent Psychology Service, and it's an information talk aimed at school-age children and teenagers. So, an overview of this talk, we're going to look at what is anxiety. We'll take a look at worries in childhood. Where does anxiety come from? What does anxiety look like? And then we're going to go through some strategies on how you can support your child with anxiety. And at the very end, then we'll go over the take-home messages from today's talk. So, first and foremost, what is anxiety? Anxiety is a feeling of unease, such as worry or fear, and it can be mild or severe. And the word itself tends to be used when worry or fear is nagging and it persists over time. The word anxiety is often used when the fear is about something in the future rather than what is happening right now. And everyone has feelings of anxiety at some point in their life. It's a normal adaptive response to threat. So we've all experienced anxiety at some point in our lives, children and adults, and it is a normal adaptive response to threat. We tend to understand anxiety as involving a combination of physical sensations in our body, so that might be the butterflies in the stomach that you feel when you're nervous, worry thoughts in our heads, so for example, what if I don't make it to my interview on time, and specific behaviours, so that might be nail biting or persistently checking the interview time or leaving really extra early to make sure you get to the interview on time. So in anxiety, these anxious bodily feelings, worry thoughts, and behaviours all impact upon each other and can lead to a cycle of anxiety. So, in simpler terms, this is just showing that feelings, thoughts, and behaviours are all involved in anxiety. So, now we're going to take a look at the cycle of anxiety. So, with the cycle of anxiety, we first and foremost have an anxiety provoking situation. So, let's say if you're afraid of dogs, the anxiety provoking situation would be if you're walking down the street and you see a big dog coming towards you. So, you're going to start having worrying thoughts. So, what might you be thinking if you see this dog coming towards you? You might be thinking, what if that dog runs over here and bites me? So, that's the worrying thought in your head. And that's going to lead to a bodily reaction. So, how might you feel when you have that thought? You may begin to shake or feel sick, or perhaps your palms will start to get sweaty. Generally, feelings of distress. And that's going to lead to a certain behavior. So, what might you do in that situation to feel better when you're anxious? You may avoid the dog, so you may simply cross the street so that you don't encounter the dog. So that's the behavior there. So this is the cycle which shows once we encounter an anxiety provoking situation, we experience worrying thoughts, bodily reactions, and a certain behavior out of that. And we can look at this again for children, so that children experience the same cycle of anxiety. So let's say if we have a child that's perhaps nervous about speaking in public. So the anxiety provoking situation there may be that, your child has to do a presentation in front of the whole class. So that will lead to worrying thoughts in your child's head. So what might your child be thinking? They may be thinking, what if all the other children laugh at me? What if I forget my words? What if I mumble? Those kind of worrying thoughts will be going through their heads, and that's going to lead to a bodily reaction. So how might they feel? And again, they may start to feel sick, or perhaps their palms will be sweaty, or they may begin to shake. They're the general feelings of distress, and then that will lead to a behavior. So what might your child do to feel better? So what they might do is perhaps say they feel too sick to go to school that day, and that is just avoiding the presentation, which is the anxiety provoking situation. So that cycle of anxiety holds true for both adults and for children. Now we'll take a look at worry and anxiety in childhood. Children tend to feel worried or anxious about different things at different ages, and many of these worries are a normal part of growing up, and they do gradually fade away. So fears are a normal and natural part of everyday life, and most children do experience similar fears at particular ages. Now, the exact age that they experience that fear and the amount of fear they experience may vary, but there are typical fears and worries that show up at particular ages. So now we'll take a look at the different fears at different ages. So between ages 1 to 3, children often have a fear of separation and stranger anxiety. So they may become quite clingy or upset when they're separated from their caregivers. And this is a normal stage in a child's development, and it does tend to ease off at around age 3. And then between ages 4 to 6, children typically fear animals and insects, and they may start to have more imaginative fears here. So they may fear monsters in the dark or under their bed. And they may begin to fear catastrophes at this age as well. So things like fires or earthquakes or robbers. They're beginning to become aware of the world around them at this age, and they may begin to hear about these catastrophes on the news or on the radio. So it can creep into their fears at this age. And then school age children, they tend to have more specific fears. So children over the age of 7, they do become more aware of their peers around them, and they're more aware of the school pressures that may be present. So they may start to worry about school exams or tests and friendships at school, and they may become more aware of death at this age as well. And then coming into the teenage years and adolescence, teenagers are becoming much more self-conscious, and they often fear not fitting in and may have social anxiety. So perhaps they may begin to worry about speaking out or doing a presentation in front of others, and they may have possible anxiety about sexuality at this age as well. So the question we have to look at is this a normal level of anxiety or worry for my child to have? And we will look at how to answer that in a moment. So how do you decide if your child's fear is unusual? Simply put, you don't. There is no such thing as an unusual or abnormal fear. All fears are normal, but some are simply more intense, more extensive, and or more intrusive than others. So that's an important take-home message there, that all fears are normal. There is no such thing as an abnormal fear. Some are just more intense or more intrusive than others. So where does anxiety in children come from? So we've just said that all children experience similar worries and fears at certain ages. So why do some children experience these worries and fears more intensely than others? So a nice little analogy here is you can think of anxiety like a cake, so the anxiety cake. And just like a cake, there's multiple ingredients that can lead to a child becoming anxious. So there's different factors at play. So child's temperament, a child's genes, learning difficulties if present, traumatic events if they've happened in the child's past, the child's environment, and how that child was parented. So if we take a look at these ingredients in the anxiety cake here, we can see that we can't change a child's temperament, and we can't change their genes, and we can't change whether or not they have learning difficulties, and unfortunately we can't change any traumatic events that may have happened to our children in the past. But the two things the parents and caregivers can alter is a child's environment and the way the child is parented. So we don't think the parents cause their children to be anxious, but we do think that they're in the best position to help their child grow in confidence. What does anxiety look like in children? The answer is it pretty much looks the same as it does in adults, and we're going to explore that a little bit more now. Anxiety presents itself in 3 ways. So the physical reactions or the sensations in the body, the worried or anxious thoughts, and the anxiety related behaviours, or we sometimes call these safety behaviours. And we've already touched on this a little bit already when we spoke about the cycle of anxiety. And the physical reactions or the sensations in the body are usually what a child notices first when they begin to feel anxious, and that's related to the fight or flight response. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on. And anxious children often have anxious thoughts that center around some type of danger or threat. So they might worry that they'll get hurt or that some harm will come to somebody in their family or somebody that they love. Or they may fear being left out by their friends or laughed at by their classmates. And we call these what if thoughts. So, what if my friends laugh at me? What if I get left out? And we'll talk around strategies to help your child with these unhelpful thoughts later on. And anxiety also impacts on a child's behaviour, and much of this manifests as either reassurance seeking or avoidant behaviour. So, for example, a child who is anxious when they're separated from their mother may seek reassurance by perhaps looking to ring their mum when they're separated from her. And avoidant behaviour can be quite subtle as well. So perhaps the obvious avoidance behaviour will be if a child refused to go somewhere without their mother, and a more subtle avoidance behaviour would be if a child clung to their mother at a birthday party, let's say. So they agree to go to the birthday party as long as their mother goes, but then they cling to their mother when they're at the birthday party. So they're still avoiding the anxiety provoking situation as they're clinging to their mother. And we'll look at these now in turn. So we'll start with the physical reactions or sensations in the body. There are many common physical signs of anxiety, and we'll all be familiar with these symptoms. So the common ones may be nausea or sick stomach, headaches, a racing heart, a feeling of dizziness, muscle tension, difficulty getting to sleep or staying asleep, and an upset stomach as well. And all of these are very common. And adults and children both experience these. As adults, we do understand that this is just our body's way of reacting to feeling anxious or nervous, and we're very familiar with these feelings. But children, they do experience the exact same feelings, but they don't have the understanding that these sensations are just nerves. It's not that obvious for children. And they often first become aware of the physical sensations in their bodies when they're feeling nervous. So the feeling comes first for kids, and they often do not know that these feelings are normal. And as we all know, these sensations are quite unpleasant and can be distressing at times, and children can then interpret these sensations as confirmation that something terrible is about to happen, which again leads to more worry and more worried feelings. So it's very important to help children become aware of the impact worries can have on their bodies so that they can recognize when they're starting to feel anxious and understand that these are normal feelings, and it does not mean that something terrible is going to happen, and these feelings cannot hurt them. So, why do our bodies react like this? And the answer is evolution, and we're going to take a look at that now. The purpose of the fight or flight response is evolutionary. It kept us alive by helping protect people by preparing them to combat or escape potential danger. It's also been compared to an alarm that goes off in the brain when a threat is perceived that allows us to fight or to run away. So why do our bodies react like this? And where do all these horrible physical sensations that we just talked about come from? And it's due to this fight or flight or sometimes freeze response. So we either fight the danger, run away from the danger, or sometimes we freeze. And early humans needed this as they were often in situations of physical danger. So there was historical threats such as tigers and bears and things like that. And this alarm system in the brain evolved for their survival. They needed it to survive. But as we humans have evolved, this alarm system or the fight or flight response has remained. So the response is triggered by the release of adrenaline, which leads to bodily changes such as rapid heart rate, increased breathing, sweating, nausea, and it leaves us feeling jittery or pumped up. And this response also impacts on our brain and how we think about things. When we're in the fight or flight mode, we can no longer think rationally or clearly as our Stone Age brain has taken over and all we think about is survival. So, this is true for both adults and children, and it's an important message here. So, our fight or flight response, it affects our body by causing those physical sensations like the increased heart rate and the heavy breathing and the sweating, but it also affects the way that we think as it turns on our primitive Stone Age brain. So we cannot think rationally when we're in this fight or flight response. So in fight or flight mode, we don't think rationally or clearly. Our Stone Age brain has taken over and all we think about is survival. So if we think about the way our brain is made up, it's divided into two sections. The rational area of the brain is located at the front, and that's the prefrontal cortex. And this area deals with control, planning, attention. It's the more sophisticated area of the brain. And then the lower brain, it's the more primitive part. And this area includes the amygdala, which controls our emotional responses. And when our fight or flight response kicks in, the lower brain, in particular the amygdala, takes over. So the alarm part of the brain takes over, and the rational part of the brain is no longer in control. So we can't think rationally or clearly. While we don't face the same physical dangers anymore, our minds and our bodies still work the same. The alarm now goes off in response to modern day problems such as bills, interviews, spelling tests, football matches, or falling out with friends, but we can't run away from these problems. And when the alarm goes off and the fight or flight response starts, it can take between 20 to 60 minutes for adrenaline levels to fall and for the body to return to its pre arousal levels. So the minds and the bodies haven't evolved much from this primal stage. Even though we don't have to run away from prehistoric threats anymore, our alarm or the amygdala still goes off in response to our modern day problems. And it's important to note there that it can take between 20 to 60 minutes for our adrenaline levels to fall to the pre-arousal stage again. And later on, we'll look at some strategies on how we can improve that. So next, we're going to look at the worry or the anxious thoughts that we experience when we're feeling anxiety. So in addition to the bodily sensations, anxiety tends to be accompanied by worry-related thoughts. As said earlier, these thoughts tend to focus on things that may happen in the future and can sometimes be called what-if thoughts. And these kind of thoughts are very common, and again, they can be helpful in that they help us to think out problems. However, if they keep going and take over our thinking, they're not helpful and they will lead to those anxious feelings that we discussed. So when our primitive brain is turned on, we experience these anxious thoughts, these what-if thoughts. So they occur for all of us, not just for children. It's the same in adults as well. So examples of these what if thoughts might be, what if I make a mistake in my homework? What if I fail the spelling test? What if I run out of money before payday and I can't pay the bills? Things like this. These are the what if thoughts that we experience when we're worried or anxious. So thirdly, we're going to look at anxiety related or safety behaviour. What does anxious behaviour in children look like? Anxious children may be irritable or tearful or clingy. They may wet the bed sometimes or experience bad dreams. And a big one that we'll be looking at is anxious children are constantly reassurance seeking. So an example of that is if they're separated from their parent or caregiver, they may continually look for phone contact with their parent or caregiver. They may be upset going back to school after the weekend or after the school holiday. And another big one that we'll be looking at is avoidance behaviour. So anxious children often avoid things. So for instance, they may avoid or stop going to football practice or to gymnastics after school. And the two big ones there that I mentioned, the reassurance seeking and the avoidance, they do work in the short term. So reassurance works in the short term, but in the long term, it's not helpful. And it tends to result in more and more reassurance being needed from the child. So later on, we're going to look at some strategies on helping to reduce reassurance seeking. And then avoidance behaviour. We know ourselves that if we avoid something that causes us anxiety, it does bring immediate relief. So it looks like a very attractive option, but again, in the long term, it's not useful. If our children never face their fears, their anxiety will be reinforced and the cycle will continue. So we're going to look at some strategies later on to help our children to face their fears. And as I mentioned briefly earlier on, it's important to note that avoidance can be subtle. So it's not always as obvious as the child of refusing to go somewhere, but it can be as simple as a child clinging to their parent when they're out and about, or a child offering to help their adult if they're at a birthday party to avoid speaking to their peers. So anxious behaviour, reassurance seeking and avoidance are commonly displayed and used by all of us when we're feeling nervous or anxious. For example, Nail biting when waiting for an important call, that's an anxious behaviour. Asking a friend if we look okay before we go out, that's reassurance seeking. Or putting off going to the dentist, that's avoidance. So if these behaviours are common, when does anxiety become a problem? Anxiety becomes a problem when it impacts on day-to-day activities, for example, going to school, when it causes ongoing and intense distress and upset, when it impacts on existing friendships, when it comes and goes for no apparent reason, or when your child starts to avoid new experiences. So ongoing and excessive fear, it can begin to cause considerable distress or interference in everyday life, and it can cause problems for the whole family. And it prevents children from engaging in age-appropriate activities, which leads to missed opportunities to make friends and actually increases anxiety. So now we're going to look at how we can support our children with anxiety. As a parent, it is very hard to see your child upset and distressed, but the good news is anxiety is very treatable. There are many things you can do to help your child with anxious thoughts, feelings, and behaviour. But remember that anxiety is part of life, and trying to get rid of all anxiety is not possible. And actually, learning to tolerate and cope with anxiety is a lifelong skill, but it can take time and patience. So, small doses of anxiety in certain situations are useful. So, for example, if we didn't feel anxious, we wouldn't bother studying for an exam or preparing for a presentation or training for a football match. So, we do need small doses of anxiety. And since anxiety is everywhere, one of the greatest skills that we can teach our children is the skill to tolerate it when it does occur. So, we're going to look at some positive strategies to help your child overcome anxiety. The strategies that we're going to look at today are talking about it, normalising anxious thoughts and feelings, tackling worry in the body, tackling worry thoughts. We're going to look at routine. We're going to look at rethinking reassurance, facing fears, and then we'll look at a few other additional strategies to reduce anxiety. And the key thing here is to be patient and be consistent when you're trying to employ these strategies. The first one we'll look at there is talking about anxiety with our children. So first and foremost, it's really important to talk to your child about their anxiety or their worries. You need to acknowledge and validate how your child is feeling. Show them you understand how they feel, as everyone experiences anxiety. Genuine empathy will increase the chances that your child will accept your guidance and be motivated to work on reducing anxiety. So, providing accurate information about anxiety can reduce the confusion or shame that children may feel, and explaining that anxiety is normal and a common experience and that you too experience it. And you can explain this in an age appropriate way. So, just explaining that perhaps you've got a big day at work coming up, you've got a presentation to do, and you're a little bit nervous and you're starting to feel those anxious sensations like the butterflies in the tummy, but you know that they're normal feelings to have and you know that you'll be okay. So that's just talking about it and normalizing anxiety. So when you ask about feelings of anxiety, acknowledge what your child is feeling. You're sending an important message that their feelings are valued and important. And recognizing and naming these feelings is the first step toward learning to manage them in healthy, acceptable ways over time. And it is important here to note that validation doesn't always mean agreement. So if a child is terrified of going to the doctor because they need to get an injection, you don't want to belittle your child's fears, but you also don't want to amplify them. You want to listen and be empathetic and help her to understand what she's anxious about. And the message that we're looking to convey here is, I know you're scared and that's okay. I'm here and I'm going to help you get through this. When talking about anxiety with your children, it's useful to use what or why questions. These open questions give you a clearer understanding of what your child is feeling. So, for example, asking questions like, what is frightening you? Why are you scared? What do you think will happen? These open questions do not limit responses, but the important thing to note here is to be mindful of your tone when you're asking these questions. So we don't want to say things like, why on earth would you be afraid of that? We just want to be mindful of our tone when asking these what or why questions. The second strategy we're going to look at here is normalising anxious thoughts and feelings. So we've just looked at talking about it, and now we're going to look at normalising it. Normalising anxiety helps to explain what anxiety is and the physical effects it has on our bodies to your child. Teach your child to recognise signs of anxiety in themselves and to ask for help when it strikes. Naming it, so children may experience the physical symptoms of anxiety and may not have the language to describe how they are feeling. So butterflies or pains in the tummy may mean worry, stress, or feeling nervous. Children may not have the word anxiety. So by normalising anxiety, we simply mean explaining anxiety to children. And it can be very useful, particularly for younger children, to draw out a picture of the body on a piece of paper and ask them to colour in on the picture where they feel worry in their body. So perhaps asking them to remember a time where they felt a little bit nervous. So for example, that time they had to go to the dentist, and then asking them to colour in on the picture of the body, where did you feel it when you felt nervous? So if they felt it in the stomach, they can colour in the tummy. If they felt sweaty palms, they can colour in their palms. Things like that, just to explain and normalise anxiety and explain that these physical symptoms are normal and we all experience them, both adults and children. When normalising anxiety, it's important to explain that anxiety is normal. Everyone experiences anxiety from time to time, and although anxiety feels uncomfortable, it is temporary and it will eventually decrease. So it's helpful to describe it as being like a wave that builds up and then it ebbs away again, and it will pass. It's also important to explain that anxiety is not dangerous. So these sensations that we experience in anxious situations are normal and unpleasant, but they won't hurt us. Another important thing to explain is that anxiety is adaptive, so we need some anxiety, and in fact, anxiety can help us. It alerts us to threats and it protects us from danger. It can help us perform at our best and it motivates us to study for an exam or to train for a big game. So the most important take-home point here is that anxiety is normal, and we really can't stress this enough. So you can model this as well. So share with your child in an age appropriate way a time that you felt anxious. So for example, if you have a big meeting coming up at work, you can share that with your child and say things like, I have this big meeting coming up and I'm feeling nervous about it, and I know that I'm feeling nervous because I'm starting to feel the butterflies in my stomach, but it's okay. I know that this is normal and that I'm just feeling a little bit nervous. We've looked at talking about it and normalizing it, and now we're going to look at tackling anxiety in the body. So relaxation is an important way that we can tackle anxiety in the body. And relaxation techniques do three things. They reduce the muscle tension, they help us control our breathing, and it gives your child a sense of control over their worries. So remember we spoke about the fight or flight response, and when we're anxious we get ready to take action. So our muscles do tense up and they're getting ready to fight or to flight, and our breathing can quicken, and it leads to the other unpleasant physical sensations that I mentioned earlier on. So relaxation is key to reducing this muscle tension and helping us control our breathing and our bodily sensations. There are many different relaxation techniques out there, and you may be familiar with some of these already. So things like deep breathing, muscular relaxation, relaxing imagery, meditation, and mindfulness. And mindfulness is becoming a lot more common in schools now. So you can even have that conversation with your child and ask them, have they learned any mindfulness or relaxation techniques in school? And perhaps you can practice those together. And whatever technique you choose, it's very important to introduce and regularly practice relaxation exercises with your child when they're calm. So that's the key to making sure that these relaxation techniques are effective. They need to be practiced when your child is calm. And the aim of this is that they will become very familiar with these exercises and will be able to use them then when they are feeling very stressed or anxious. And these exercises sound easy, but often they are not, and they do take practice. Deep breathing is a very effective technique to use to slow down the breath and calm the mind and the body down. And it sounds very simple, but it does take practice to perfect this and for in order for it to be effective when you are in a state of anxiety or stress. So a very simple technique here is to count to three in your head as you breathe slowly inwards through the nose, and then count to four slowly when breathing out. And with practice, you can say relax while breathing out. And it's a quick and easy tool to manage feelings of anxiety that your child will be able to use just about anywhere. Focusing on the here and now is another great relaxation technique, and this is very similar to mindfulness. And a lot of kids are learning this in school now at the moment. So, with practice, we can switch our mental focus from anxiety to concentrated attention on the here and now, and in turn, that changes our emotional responses. So, you can take the opportunity to lead by example or to model this. So, using mindful practices at home, in the car, or when you're eating. So, for example, a very simple way to do this is if you're all at home eating dinner together, getting your children to say, what can you feel? What can you smell? What can you see? And what can you touch? And just introducing these mindful practices as much as you can in order for them to get used to the idea. And again, it does take time and practice, and it's important to practice this in order for it to be effective when needed, when your child is feeling a little bit anxious. But you can be on the lookout for activities to engage your child in this activity. So even if you're in the car going into town, just asking your child what you can feel, what you can smell, what you can see, and what you can touch, just to get into that habit. And studies have shown that mindfulness has an impact on the emotional part of the brain, so the amygdala that we spoke about, the alarm part of the brain. And it makes us better regulators, and it helps to strengthen the connections between those areas associated with higher order brain functions, so attention and concentration. So the studies kind of back this up, that mindfulness is a very useful technique to use in order to regulate our emotions. Another way to tackle anxiety in the body is through the diet. So there is an increasing evidence that a diet that is high in sugar, additives, or fat can have a negative impact on a child's physical and mental health. A balanced diet and a good breakfast are important, especially before an anxiety-inducing event like a school exam. The effects of too much caffeine can mimic the effects of anxiety on the body, so it's important to limit caffeine where possible, especially when a child is anxious. And just to be aware there of hidden caffeine. So most of us are aware that cola drinks and coffee contain caffeine, but just to be mindful that tea, including green tea, contains caffeine as well, and energy drinks such as Red Bull and Monster, they contain caffeine, and also plain chocolate contains caffeine. Another way to tackle anxiety in the body is through physical activity. So, generally, children and teenagers are recommended to have 30 minutes of physical activity every day. There is also evidence to suggest that physical activity can help with symptoms of depression and anxiety in children and adolescents. So, if you just think about what physical activity your children already do, and then is there any way that this could even be slightly increased? So the benefits are clear. It's physical activity, it's good for the body and for the mind. It boosts serotonin, which is the happy hormone, and it also provides a distraction from worried thoughts. So now we're going to look at how we can tackle the worried thoughts, and we're going to do this through a process called detective thinking. So in order to tackle worried or anxious thoughts, we need to know what are thoughts and why are they important. So thoughts are things that we say to ourselves in our heads. They're like ideas that pop into our heads, and we have thousands of thoughts every day. And thoughts are important because they cause and influence our feelings and behaviour. And thoughts can either be calm and helpful or worried and unhelpful. So explaining thoughts to children and teenagers is very important. Thoughts are quite an abstract concept, and we don't tend to make the connection between thoughts, feelings, and behaviours immediately. So, a nice, simple way to explain what a thought is to a child is to say a thought is an idea that goes through your mind from moment to moment. It's very important to know and teach children that thoughts are not facts, and just because we think something, it doesn't mean it's true. And as such, worried thoughts tend not to be true and can be changed to calm thoughts by being a good detective and looking for real evidence. So, this is a very important message. It's one of the take home messages that thoughts are not facts, and just because we think something, it doesn't mean it's true. So, now we're going to take a look at detective thinking. The idea of detective thinking means to catch, check, and change anxious thoughts. And the idea of detective thinking comes from a book called Overcoming Your Child's Fears and Worries, and we will include the reference for that book at the end of this presentation. So, the process of detective thinking means helping your child to understand what thoughts are and figure out his or her own worry thoughts, understand why thoughts are so important, that they influence our feelings, that they're not facts, and that they can be changed. And then to challenge worried thoughts and come up with more helpful thoughts, and in turn begin to feel better and feel less anxious. This approach allows you to teach your child about the relationship between our thoughts, feelings, and actions in a very accessible way. And when children have an understanding of this process, it can then be applied to any and all anxious thoughts. So, how do we do this? The key to detective thinking is to look for evidence about whether our worried thoughts are actually true. So, we look at the evidence to see if the worried thought is true or false. We then ask open questions, those what or why questions that I mentioned earlier on, and we try to help our children figure out if the worried thought is really true. Then we come up with a more helpful new thought and remind ourselves of this new thought. So, an example of this is we can use an example of a child who's afraid of public speaking or gets a little bit worried when they're asked to speak in front of their class. So, let's call this child Jenny. And Jenny's asked to do a presentation in front of her whole class. So we need to explore with Jenny, why is she so nervous about doing this presentation? So we're going to use our open questions here. So what is it about the presentation that you're worried about? What do you think is going to happen? And through using these open questions, we're going to learn that Jenny's afraid that she's going to become too nervous when she's doing the presentation, and her voice is going to become shaky, and that her classmates will laugh at her. So through this open question, we've identified the worried thought there that she's going to get laughed at by her classmates. So we're going to continue doing our detective thinking with Jenny here, and we're going to look at the evidence for and the evidence against the worried thoughts. And we're going to ask questions again like, have you ever done a presentation before? What happened that time? Have you ever seen your other classmates do a presentation? Did they seem nervous? Did anyone laugh at them? Do you think your classmates will be nervous about doing their presentation too? So using these questions, we're looking at for the evidence for and the evidence against the worried thought. And then we're going to come up with a more realistic thought. So realistically, you're going to work out with Jenny that yes, there is a chance that some people might laugh at her when she's doing her presentation, but the evidence suggests that everyone who has to do the presentation will be a little bit nervous, and so everyone will understand that Jenny's nervous too. And everyone else probably feels the same way as Jenny, but they're going to get up and they're going to do the presentation anyway. And afterwards, they're going to feel really proud because they know that they cope and they won't be as nervous next time they have to do the presentation. So there you've changed the worried thought into a more realistic thought. And this concept can be used with younger children as well. And it may be useful to introduce a character to help a younger child grasp this. So maybe doing this through the use of Peppa Pig or some other TV character that your child might like. So some useful questions here when you're looking at the evidence, when you're using the detective thinking. What are the chances of this happening? What has happened in the past? What else could happen? Are your thoughts sensible? Could you cope if the thing did happen? Are you being too hard on yourself? Are you trying to read someone's mind? So these questions are really useful to help your child with the detective thinking. So now we're going to take a look at the importance of routine in helping our children overcome anxiety. Children of all ages find routines reassuring, so trying to stick to regular daily routines is really helpful for anxious children. Routines increase predictability and help children to feel like they have more control. But too rigid a routine can undermine a child's self confidence. It's important to teach a child to be adaptable and cope with unexpected changes. So, we all know that everybody, adults and children, feel more stress when things are a little bit chaotic, and children feel the same way as that. So, for anxious children in particular, it's very useful to have routines in place to keep your child as calm as possible. And now we're going to look at rethinking reassurance. Offering reassurance is very often a parent's first response to an anxious or upset child. So saying things like, "No need to worry, you'll be fine, don't worry, I'm here." This is a perfectly normal parental response, but it is one that parents of an anxious child must try to learn to resist. So even if you think about it yourself for a moment, has the statement "don't worry" or "stop worrying" ever stopped you from worrying? Probably not. So it's not very effective. Most parents already know that giving reassurance over and over again is not only exhausting, but also it doesn't work. So it's like a band-aid in that it only works in the short term. In the long term, it leads to greater dependence on more reassurance and turns into a vicious cycle and a bottomless pit. And it also sends the message that there's actual danger that the child needs to be protected from. So if we think about it, a child who's always told, "It's okay, mommy's here," can hardly be blamed for panicking when he or she runs into a problem and mommy's not there to help them. So what can we do instead of offering reassurance? The aim here is to make your child feel like they're more in control of their worries, even when you're close by. And an important thing to do here is to check in with yourself and see how much reassurance you are asked for and how much you give voluntarily, because it can become a bit of a habit where you're just giving reassurance when you may not always be asked for it. So if you provide a lot of reassurance, gradually reduce it and encourage the child to find the answers or reassurance in themselves. And you could do this by using the detective thinking, asking those open questions that we looked at a few moments ago. It is hard to do and you will encounter resistance, but it's worthwhile to stick at this because it does work. So instead of offering reassurance, ask questions about what is worrying your child and use detective thinking to find more helpful thoughts. So you're going to look at the evidence for the worrying thought and the evidence against and look at a more realistic thought. Children need to learn that they can cope and they need to be given opportunities to learn that as well. So just gradually reduce your reassurance and start to use your detective thinking in place of reassurance. Next, we're going to look at facing their fears, and we're going to do this through a process of avoiding avoidance. A natural reaction to a threat is to get away from it, to avoid it. And avoiding something that makes us feel acutely anxious brings immediate relief from the unpleasant anxious sensations and thereby becomes a very attractive option the next time we are faced with something anxiety provoking. However, by not facing the feared situation, we'd never get to discover whether it really was as bad as we feared or would we have been able to cope with it. So the aim is to encourage our children to have a go at facing their fear. So anxious children too learn that avoiding things that make them feel anxious leads to feeling better, and parents often agree to this avoidance as it reduces the upset experienced by the child. And this can lead to a lot of focus and attention on the anxiety related behaviour. So children get a lot of attention for the crying and the panicking that they experience when they are nervous or anxious about something. And this is a very natural reaction, but it can lead to a vicious cycle where the anxious behaviour is receiving a lot of attention, which helps to keep the behaviour going. So we can't promise our children that all their fears are unrealistic. We can't promise them that they're not going to fail the test or that the kids in the class aren't going to laugh at them. But we can express confidence that they are going to be okay and that we believe that they can cope. And as our children faces their fears, their anxiety levels will drop over time and their confidence will start to grow. But if we let our children avoid situations that causes them worry, we're reinforcing their belief that they won't be able to cope. So unfortunately, although it's very hard to do, we do have to face our fears in order to reduce anxiety. So we need to have a go at facing our fears in order for our anxiety to dissipate a little. It's therefore helpful to encourage your child to gradually face their fears by helping them break them down into small, manageable chunks and having a go. The aim is to gradually give brave or having a go behaviour more attention than the anxious behaviour. It's important to be realistic about goals. You don't want to aim too high too soon or promise something that could happen. You want to focus on the child's ability to cope. And the key here is praise, praise, praise. So children do pick up on the most subtle messages from parents about how capable they are or how difficult a certain task may be. And it's important for your child that when they're facing their fears, you don't let your own worries show. So we need to monitor our own behaviour so that we're not reinforcing their fears. So this idea of breaking down the fear into smaller manageable steps and rewarding your child for each step, it's a great way to do this. And it's important to start with a nice easy step that your child is already able to do. And repetition of the steps is key. So repeat the one step over and over again and only move on to the following step when they're comfortable on the current step. So if we go back to the example of Jenny, who's afraid of public speaking, the ultimate goal there at the top of the ladder may be that she's able to do a presentation in front of her whole class. And you can break that goal down into 6 or 7 smaller, more manageable steps. And you may start, the first step may be a simple step, something that she can already do that doesn't cause her too much anxiety, because we want her to have an easy win to begin with. So the first step may be that she has to ask her teacher a question in class in front of everybody. And it's something that Jenny can do already, but it does cause her a little bit of worry. And then when she does that, she can get a small reward for that. So it may just be maybe you buy her favourite sweets after school, or you might go for a hot chocolate with her after school. And it's important to repeat that step so that she's comfortable with that step a few times before moving on to the next step. And the second step may be then that she has to answer a question in front of the whole class that her teacher is going to ask her. And then you may repeat that for a week. So she may stay on that step for a week and then move on that maybe she'll ask a question in class and repeat that step, and she'll get a reward for each step, and she's building her way up until she's at the point where she's comfortable to do a presentation in front of her whole class. And when you're breaking these fears and worries down, you can involve your child in this. It's very useful to do that, in fact. So they may be able to tell you what's causing them the most anxiety. They'll be able to tell you what the first step can be and how that can be broken down until they reach their goal. And the rewards are often very motivating for children as well. And praise is key here. So giving attention and praise is probably the most effective way to influence a child's behaviour. Praise should be clear and specific so that the child understands exactly what it is that they have done that you're pleased about. So it should be specific. So when Jenny does her presentation, you praise Jenny by saying, I'm really, really proud of you because you stood up in front of your class and did that presentation even though you were nervous. So making sure it's clear and specific. Praise any and all attempts of having a go. So even if Jenny was on step 3 and she was supposed to ask a question in class and she wasn't able to, perhaps she put her hand up, but when the teacher called on her, she wasn't able to ask that question. That's okay, she tried, so we're going to praise the attempt or the having a go behaviour. The idea is to give more praise and attention to the having a go behaviour rather than to the anxiety, the anxious behaviours. So consider appropriate rewards when children have tried to face their fears or succeeded in facing their fears. And these don't have to cost a lot of money. Perhaps you can decide that you'll go to the park after school one day if Jenny's able to ask the question in class, or perhaps you'll do a jigsaw together in the evening, or you'll watch a movie together. They don't have to cost money, but it's important to have appropriate rewards when your child is trying to face their fears. So now, just before the end, we're going to look at some brief additional strategies to reduce anxiety. Worry time or a worry list or a worry box is very useful for some children. So worry time is basically setting aside a time when you can sit with your child and talk without distractions. And this should be limited to half an hour. So you can say to your child, if your child is particularly anxious throughout the day, you're going to set some time aside that evening, and the two of you are going to sit down and talk about all the things that they're worried about. And that just allows your child to realize that their worries aren't going to be forgotten or dismissed. You're busy during the day as well, so there's no point in you trying to do 10 things at once and try and listen to your child. You want to be able to listen to your child fully and hear what they're saying. So you're going to set aside some time in the evening, perhaps from 7 to half 7, where you're going to sit down together and discuss their worries. And this is really useful for children to know that their worries aren't going to be forgotten. And another thing that you can incorporate here is a worry list or a worry box. And that just basically means your child keeps a record of their worries. So they may make a note and pop it into the worry box, and then they can carry on with their day. And it may sound a little bit harsh, but children realize then that their worries won't be forgotten or dismissed, and that saving worries doesn't help. So saving worries, it shows a child that nothing disastrous will happen when they don't worry. So when they worry during the day, and you don't have time to talk about it right there and then, you can say to your child, we'll discuss this during worry time this evening, but why don't you write that down and pop it into the worry box? And your child then can pull out that worry during worry time and you can discuss it then. And it just shows your child that even though they haven't spent time worrying about it immediately, nothing disastrous has happened and they will get to that problem later on. Distraction techniques can also be very helpful, particularly for younger children. So you can be on the lookout for activities that will engage your child and any activities that will take your child's mind off worry, and they can add it to their worry list, and then you can do your distraction technique after that to take their mind off that worry for the moment. So for younger children, you can create games that will use their full attention. So for example, if they're anxious about going to nursery, you can play games in the car on the way there. So things like, let's see who can spot the most red cars. Distraction techniques are a really simple, nice way to help young children manage their worries. Another tip to reduce anxiety is just simply getting up and moving. So research has shown that moving the body and moving into another environment, even just another room, gives the brain new information which it then must process. It's a very simple distraction technique. So let's say you're talking to your teenager in the kitchen and they're explaining to you that they're really worried about this exam they have coming up. Simply saying to them, come on and we'll go down to your room and we'll have a little chat. That can be really helpful because their brain is going to have to process the new information that it's taking in from the new environment. So it's a very simple way to just calm down those anxious thoughts. Parenting an anxious child, are you feeling worried too? So parenting is hard at the best of times, let alone when a child is anxious, and sometimes it can be difficult to figure out when to be sympathetic and when to ask your child to try a little harder. And it's especially difficult when you share the same fears as your child. So you may feel empathy with their worries and feel inclined to protect your child, and that's completely normal and completely understandable. It's important to separate your own concerns from those of your child and to look after yourself and to your needs also. If you are feeling worried or feeling empathetic towards your child's worries, that's completely understandable. But it is important just to keep a check on your own worries and your own behaviour so that we're not reinforcing our children's anxiety. So the main take-home messages from today's talk is that anxiety is normal and a part of everyday life, and it's important to talk about it with our children. Anxiety consists of anxious feelings, worried thoughts, and certain behaviours, and we need to explain this and normalise it to our children. It's important to calm the mind and the body, and we can do this through routine, relaxation, diet, and activity. Thoughts are not true or they're not facts and they can be changed, and we can do this through detective thinking. It's important to rethink reassurance and to avoid avoidance, and have a go, use praise and use reward, and most importantly, look after yourselves as well. Here are some useful references and additional reading if you're interested in the topic of anxiety in children. So thank you all for listening to this presentation, and please feel free to share it with your friends and family if you found it useful. Thank you.